When we met 4 years ago, we had an opportunity to talk about the life and career and legacy of Shai Agnon. As Brian said, Israel's only Nobel laureate in literature. When he won the prize in 1966, just about exactly 55 years ago, December 10th. December 10th is Alfred Nobel's Yahrzeit. So that's when the prize is always given. So almost exactly 55 years ago, Agnon received the prize. That year, in 1966, the ceremony happened to fall out on Hanukkah. And there are all types of stories about Agnon observing Hanukkah in Stockholm. We don't have time for those now. But when we met and we talked about his life, I had an opportunity to give more of his biography and the wide scope of things that led him from the little town of Buchach, about which we'll talk about momentarily, the little town of Buchach, which was in Galicia. It was in the easternmost reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when Agnon lived there at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And today, of course, is in the Western Ukraine. But because we covered all of that material 4 years ago, I leave it to you to, I guess, check your notebooks and to review if anything is a little rusty in your memory. And tonight we're going to focus on this one particular story without going into all of that background. The story is called Hidden Menorah, the tale or the fable or the legend of the menorah, of a particular menorah that was associated with Agnon's hometown. It's a story that in English is called, again, the tale of the menorah, but a ma'aseh can also, although Agnon's using it in its Hebrew sense, Agnon wrote in Hebrew, but of course he thought in Yiddish. And we all know that in Yiddish, a maaseh is not exactly a ma'aseh. A maaseh is a kind of literary genre all unto its own. Hasidic tales are maasios, ma'asiot, and it means something entirely different. My point here is that the story we're about to encounter is a story. It's a story presented to us as history, let's say with a capital H, you know, the way it's practiced in academic departments in universities around the world. But it's also a maaseh. It's also a tale that's part of a much larger legendarium. It's a story that was first published in 1957, which is somewhat late in Agnon's career. And it appeared in this volume, which was actually only published posthumously, meaning the story was published in a newspaper and then later anthologized in this volume, which only appeared posthumously. This book, Ir Lo'ah, which we have translated in our English edition as A City in Its Fullness, is Agnon's, actually it's his largest, it's his fattest volume in the collection of the 23 volumes in the collected writings of Shai Agnon. And it contains a cycle of stories that cover 300 years of the tales and history and folklore and customs of his hometown. It's a task that he set for himself after the Shoah, which of course he was already living here in the land of Israel, in Yerushalayim, during the Holocaust, and he did not experience it directly. But when the news arrives that Buchach has been destroyed, that his hometown had been completely and utterly, the Jewish aspect of it had been completely and utterly annihilated, throughout the 1950s and 60s, leading up to his death in 1970, he set himself to become the chronicler of his town. Now, of course, all over the world, there were survivors and historians who were setting to work to chronicle the world that was destroyed. Agnon does so not with the utensils of a conventional historian, but of an imaginative author of fiction. And this collection of many, many dozens of stories of his town, again, arranged largely chronologically, leading you through a kind of guided tour of history, presents things that are actually historical with a capital H, things that are, the stories themselves are populated by very many actual historical figures, including many of the rabbis that served in Buchach, which for a small little town laid claim to very many impressive rabbis that stood at its helm. Buchach itself is a town. It's not a shtetl. It was a town. When Agnon lived there at the end of the 19th century, there were about 12,000 people who lived in the town, about 60% of whom were Jewish. It's a Galician town. This is not the Russian Pale of settlement. If you read Agnon's stories and in your head you're seeing, well, pictures from Marc Chagall, like the Hebrew publisher put on the cover of the new edition here, you're missing something. If you're reading Agnon and your mind is populating the scenes with images drawn from Fiddler on the Roof, you're looking at a different world. That was a different Jewish community and reality altogether, even though they are both part of the larger Eastern European experience. And in Ir Umloa, Agnon is giving you the entirety of the history through the Agadah, through the imagined tales. And he's almost engaging in a kind of polemic against the university historians, saying, who's to say that your history with a capital H is superior to my imaginative telling? Just because a fictional story didn't happen, that doesn't make it any less true. And what we're about to see is a kind of signal example, a parade example of how he sets about doing that in the tale of the menorah. The story begins like this. We'll read parts of it. This is not the whole thing. We've made the text available to you, and I invite you, if you haven't done so already, to read it over on your own afterwards. Rav Nachman, this is not Nachman of Breslov. It's a character in the story named Rav Nachman. We have no reason to believe this is a historical figure. As we go through the story, even reading in translation, those of you learned in the Torah, those of you familiar with the Hebrew Bible and other classical Jewish sources, even reading in translation, you should be able to pick up on many of Agnon's intertexts, his kind of echoes and shout-outs and callbacks to the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, to the Mishnah, to the Gemara, to the Agadah, and to other works of Jewish folklore. Indeed, this is part of Agnon's achievement as a writer. The synthesis of the entirety, these bookshelves behind me, I'm sitting here virtually, I'm sitting here in Agnon's library, his library of over 9,000 volumes. You can see the screen behind me. Part of his achievement was to take the entirety of the Jewish canon and to distill it into modern writing and to engage in this intertextual work of writing a modern story that's drawing off of those classical sources. So as we go through, feel free to shout out. Everyone's muted, I understand, Brian, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so you can, in the chat, you can post in the chat if you identify a particular source as we go along. Again, reading in Hebrew, for those that are able, makes that kind of identification a bit easier. But even reading in translation, those of us knowledgeable about such things will be able to easily find the sources. So Rav Nachman, keeper of the royal seal, this was a kind of position that a court Jew may have filled in a non-Jewish European royal court. You know, many Jews served as what were called court Jews. They were these kinds of officials, maybe because they were money lenders, maybe because they were middlemen between different governments. There were many very distinguished Jews who served in official capacities in the non-Jewish royal and legal courts. So this character, Rabbi Nachman, he's one of them. He's the keeper of the royal seal, whatever that means. I assume it was a kind of high-level clerical position. Maybe the person, because Jews often did have a high level of literacy, who was entrusted with dealing with official state papers, who may have had the capacity to deal with to deal with documents in different languages, maybe the keeper of the records, and he would have to stamp or seal the official documents, something like that. So this Rabbi Nachman was a man of great importance in the eyes of the king. Whenever he came to the royal court, the palace attendants gave him an audience with the king, for they knew how beloved Nachman the Jew was to the king. The Almighty bestowed wisdom upon Nachman. It said, they knew how beloved Nachman the Jew was to the king. In Hebrew, it says, Ratsui lamelech. The Almighty bestowed wisdom upon Rabbi Nachman. Hashem natan chokhmah leRabbi Nachman. And of course, playing off the biblical Hashem natan chokhmah lishlomo, to King Solomon, that God gave wisdom to Solomon. And he responded with intelligent advice. The king listened and did as Rabbi Nachman had advised, and it turned out to be a blessing for the king. Then he knew how excellent was the advice Nachman had given him. After this, Rabbi Nachman was summoned to the palace court. When the king heard that Nachman was in the royal courtyard, he commanded, "Bring him to me." When the king heard ki Nachman b'chatzer, that Nachman was in the royal courtyard. So surely some of you must identify the intertexts that are at play here. Feel free to chat. But where do we see in the Bible someone standing in the royal court being called into the king? Again, feel free to post in the chat. Okay, we'll come back to it. So the king says, bring him in. Nachman entered the king's chamber. The king said to him, the advice you gave me was excellent. Ask of me now whatever you desire, and I will grant it to you. But for himself, Rabbi Nachman did not ask for a single thing. He said to the king, I am unworthy of the least of your kindnesses. Now, why would he pass up such a gift? Why would he not ask for, it's like Aladdin's 3 wishes. The king says, you name it, you got it. Ad chatzia malchut. Because the only thing better than getting a gift from the king is having the king owe you one. Whatever the king could possibly give you is not as valuable as an IOU in your pocket from the king. Because the role of this Rabbi Nachman was not just to serve the king, but to be a representative of the Jewish people, to be what was called in the medieval world a shtadlan, a representative. Like today we have like AIPAC, or we have other lobbying agencies that are out there trying to defend Israel's standing in the royal courts of Washington D.C. or in Downing Street or wherever it might be. So when you are in such a position, having that IOU from the king is much more valuable than whatever silver and gold the king might offer you now. Brian has identified Mordechai in the Purim story. Hilton has identified Yosef, but if you can point out more specifically, because Yosef's going to come back in this story. The king replied, because you have not asked for a single thing for yourself, I'll make a holy donation to your God. Rabbi Nachman did not ask for the king what it was he promised to give, and the king did not tell him. It came to pass in those days that Buchach, which again is Agnon's hometown, built itself a great synagogue. Now it doesn't tell us, there's no timestamp here. We don't yet know when those days were. We don't yet know when Rabbi Nachman was in the royal court of the king. But at that point, Buchach built itself a great synagogue. Its community of Jews had grown to nearly 250 householders. So we know this is a long time ago. If at the end of the 19th century, there were 12,000 Jews in the town, and this part of the story, there are only 250 balabatim, 250 householders, presumably it was quite a while ago. In addition to the women, the children, and all the servants of the wealthy who had come to the other towns and now lived in the city. So the people of Buchach built themselves a large synagogue in which to worship. That is the same building that the Gentiles living in the city made into a church for their gods after the city fell into the hands of Chmielnitsky, Yamach Shemo, and he had slain every Jew who had not fled in haste from the sword of his wrath. So now we begin to get the map, the timeline of where we are. This shul, this great synagogue that they built, predated 1648, 1649. You see this fellow Khmelnytsky, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, was the leader of the Ukrainian uprising against the Polish nobility, who led what was the most horrific pogrom in the history of the Jewish people until the Shoah. In 1648-49, what's called the Gzerot Tach V'Tat, there were waves of pogroms across Eastern Europe in which the numbers are debated, but many, many, many thousands, tens of thousands of Jews lost their lives. Jewish towns and villages were destroyed and pillaged. Synagogues were burnt and desecrated. So the synagogue that was built lasted until Khmelnytsky. So it has to be a certain amount of time before the middle of the 17th century. This story begins quite early on. When Khmelnytsky comes along in 1648-49, the synagogue that they had built is desecrated, and he makes reference to a story, to a local folk legend that predated Agnon. Agnon is repurposing a local piece of folklore, that this synagogue that was built sometime, let's say, for sake of argument, around the year 1600, was desecrated and turned by the Gentiles into a church. And according to tradition, the walls of that building, formerly synagogue, today church, would weep. Apparently there was some kind of engineering damage in the side of the wall, and there must have been a crack, and water, which would be collected on the roof or something, would come down in a trickle down the walls, almost like a stream of tears. And it was said in Buchach by the Jews, it's the building itself crying because of its desecration, this old synagogue now in use as a place of what in their eyes was surely idolatry. This was an old Buchach legend, which Agnon repurposes many times throughout his stories. As a matter of fact, in this particular story, the tale of the menorah, there are a lot of callbacks to all types of other stories in the Agnon arena of tales. Here is the great synagogue, not the one in our story, but the great synagogue, the later great synagogue that was built in 1728. It's the large building on the right. The smaller building in the center of the picture is the Beit Midrash. The large synagogue on the right stood from 1728 until it was demolished. The Soviet authorities claimed the building was unstable, and they demolished it. But I'm told that people in the city felt that it was really demolished in order to make space for a kind of open air market and a parking lot, which is, if you visit Buchach today, you can see the spot where the synagogue was. Although recently there was an archaeological, they were not an archaeological dig, they were digging in order to lay new sewer pipes, and they discovered the foundation of the building, and they discovered the bima, the spot where the bima had been, which still remained in a kind of destructive. If you remember in the Churva in Yerushalayim, in the old city of Yerushalayim, before the Churva was rebuilt, in the middle of the Churva, there was a kind of, you saw like the remnant of what was once the stone bima. That's more or less what it looks like in this excavation they did on that spot. And on the left, the Beit Midrash, the study hall, was standing until about 20 years ago, when it was also similarly torn down. So this great synagogue is not the great synagogue of our story, because this great synagogue wasn't built until 1728. And the previous great synagogue that the story is talking about had already been desecrated in 1648. The king commanded his metalworkers to make him a great brass menorah to place in the synagogue in Buchach in honor of Nachman. This is the gift. The king commissions a large brass menorah, a candelabrum, that will be a gift to the synagogue to show his appreciation to this Rabbi Nachman for the help he had given the king. So they make this big menorah, and it's a 7-branched menorah. That is a problem. It happens that there is a halacha. Many people are unfamiliar with this halacha. But there is a halacha that outside of the Holy Temple, we are not allowed to make the vessels and the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash because it perhaps would look like we are performing the holy sacred service of the Beit HaMikdash outside of the Holy Temple. You may be aware that in Jerusalem, there's an institute called the Temple Institute, the Machon HaMikdash, that seems to be doing exactly this. How are they able to do that in light of the halacha? It's a good question, and you can ask them the next time you go. But the menorah that the king makes as a gift to Buchach looks a lot like the temple menorah. Now, what did the temple menorah look like exactly? We're not exactly sure. In the commentaries of the Rishonim, of the medieval rabbinic authorities, there's a debate about the menorah. A lot of people, of course, point to the Arch of Titus in Rome that has this very well-known image to say, well, that's a pretty good contemporaneous source. Perhaps the artist who carved this scene of the Romans pillaging Jerusalem had some eyewitness testimony to what it looked like. I recommend to you the excellent work by my friend Professor Stephen Fine of Yeshiva University on his book on the menorah as symbol and how it went to throughout history. The menorah is perhaps the most distinct symbol of the Jewish people, and today, of course, it is the symbol of the state of Israel. But in fact, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah and the Shulchan Aruch codifies that, in principle, we are not allowed to make a menorah keneged menorah or any of the other vessels of the Beit HaMikdash. There's a serious halachic problem codified for halacha of making a menorah that resembles that of the Beit HaMikdash. But what's the problem? The king just gave us this menorah. Danger, Will Robinson. And this depicts very clearly the challenge for a figure like Rabbi Nachman. It depicts very clearly the tension built in to Jewish proximity to power. For 2,000 years, we had no power. We had limited autonomy over our own affairs in many cases, but we had no power as a community. Whatever power we had was that which devolved to us at the grace and whim of our host societies. But Jews often had a lot of proximity to power. We were very useful. We were clever. We had talents. We had connections. We had skills. Often we had money to lend. And kings are often in the need to borrow money to finance a war, to feed an army, or to expand a palace. But it's a very tricky, like the moth flying too close to the light, too close to the flame. And the predicament here of Rabbi Nachman, of this Rav Nachman, being close to the king and having influence and presumably the ability to protect Jewish interests, shows exactly how complex it is. Because now what do? The king has given you a gift, which is halachically problematic to accept. It's halachically problematic to display in the synagogue. But you don't say no. You don't say no to the king. And this is the tension of Jewish life in the diaspora. On this topic, I recommend to you the wonderful book by Professor Ruth Weiss called Jews and Power, which explores this kind of tricky relationship, and particularly as it's depicted in Jewish literature, although she does not discuss our. When they brought the menorah, which is a gift from the king, to the synagogue, the Jews saw it and beheld its 7 branches. They said, we can't place this menorah in the synagogue. If we do, we'll sin against God. On the other hand, if we do not set it in the synagogue, we'll insult the king and his gift. They're really in a pickle. They did not know what counsel to take for themselves. Even Nachman, the counselor to the king, had no solution. He said, this has all befallen us because I frequented the court of the king. But God saw his distress and sent an idea into their head. They should take the middle branch of the menorah and snap it off. And then instead of being a 7-branched menorah, like that in the temple, it's now a 6-branched menorah, and none will be the wiser. You know, Jews were very good at coming up with a clever answer to any problem. That's part of what's kept us alive as a people. That and stuffed cabbage. It's what sustained us for all those years of the exile. So the menorah stood there, and it shone for the entire time that this house of God was indeed a house for God, until the day that Israel was driven out by Khmelnytsky, and the town's Gentiles made the house of God into a church for their gods, as he mentioned earlier. So for however long, from the time of Rabbi Nachman until the middle of the 17th century, that's what they did. During the Khmelnytsky revolt, the town is pillaged. And they're coming and they're stealing everything of value from the town and from the synagogues. The Gentile, Dafka, he was a Gentile, not a Jew. The Gentile who watched the candles. You know, there was a job, you know, like there was the Goy Shel Shabbat, and there was the, you know, like we have in America, at least, you know, in shul, we had a janitor. In the synagogue that I grew up in, there was a janitor. He was a lovely African-American man. He wore a hat, you know, like a hat, like, you know, people that want to show that they're more yeshivish or more frum than other people. It was not a shul where a lot of people wore hats. It was an old-time Orthodox shul with a largely non-Orthodox population. So the joke was the only guy in the shul that wore a black hat was the African-American janitor. But it was okay because he was frummer than everybody else. Like he knew all the halachot. Like he knew how to keep the shul kitchen kosher probably better than many of the congregants, old Joe. So this Gentile who watched the candles, you know, they used to have to light candles. You know, there was no Shabbat clock in the 17th century. Friday night you went to shul, they would light the candles. So for Kabbalat Shabbat, you'd be able to see. Shabbat morning you come back, well, there's windows and hopefully sunshine. But anybody who comes back for Shabbat Mincha, it's pitch dark. So the Shabbos goy would come and he would light the candles, but he would also watch over them to make sure the whole building didn't burn down. So this Gentile, as the Ukrainians are coming in to pillage the town, this Gentile, the shul janitor, who was also a mill worker, he ground the grain. He did the shul work on the side. He took the menorah and he hid it in the river Stripa. Buchach is this small town that lies on either side of the Stripa River, this small little tributary that runs through western Ukraine. The menorah lay at the bottom of the Stripa's waters, and no one knew where it was. As for the mill worker, well, he didn't get his just reward. He died after his body got caught in the millstone's wheels, and he was ground up and cast away, and his flesh became food for the fish of the river Stripa. Here's the river Stripa. You see, in Agnon's telling, you think this is like what the Mississippi is to Mark Twain, right? A mighty river. No, it's hardly even a stream. It's this tiny little river. This idea of hiding something in the waters of the river, does that resonate with anyone? Does that call forth some kind of image from the Midrash? Yefeh, Y-I-N-N congregation. Is that answering in the name of everyone? I guess. Yosef's bones. According to the tradition, you know, when Yaakov died, we have it this week's parasha. That's why we timed this story for this week's parasha. You see, it was all destined in advance when we planned this out, Brian, 10 months ago. In this week's parasha, Yaakov dies. And he says, don't bury me in Mitzrayim, take me up to Marat HaMachpelah. And they do that. Years later, when Yosef dies, he knows it's already too late. He can't go there. Paro's not going to let them go up to Eretz Yisrael, to Canaan. So he says, just promise me that when you ultimately do leave, you'll take me with you. And according to the Midrash in Parshat Bishalach, in a few weeks' time, at Yetziat Mitzrayim, the middle of the night, Makat Bechorot, the slaying of the firstborn, the Jews are going out, and they remember, oh, Zaydi Yosef. We have to bring Yosef. We made a promise to Yosef to take him out. And nobody remembers where they had left the body, where they left the bones, until Serach Bat Asher, who's the kind of, like the elder statesman of the elder stateswoman of the story. She's like the oldest possessor of the family's institutional memory. She remembers what had happened, and she finds the bones. They take Yosef out. So we've seen already a few times Ki Nachman b'Chatzer, who was in the Chatzer, Mordechai in the Purim story. This story is very densely packed with references to Megillat Esther and to the Yosef story, Yosef in Egypt. Why do you think that these are the two central intertexts of our story? What is common to those two biblical tales that's resonating here? Does anyone have any thoughts? Well, again, we see the disadvantage of Zoom, because I'm sure if we were all in the room together, we'd be bouncing ideas off of each other. Yefeh. Jews in palaces. Yosef and Esther are the two classic examples of, oh, that's interesting. Both excellent, Brian. Both of those, I hadn't thought of that. Both the Yosef story and the Esther story are the two great biblical stories that take place outside of the land of Israel. But they're both stories of Jews in a position similar to that of this Nachman. Jews in proximity to power. Jews with the ability to influence, but yet we see exactly how limited, or what the limitations are in both cases. After some years, those who had survived Khmelnytsky's sword returned to their homeland and towns. The few survivors from Buchach also returned to the town, and there they built themselves a small Mikdash Ma'at, a small synagogue in place of a great synagogue, which the Gentiles had plundered and made into a house for their God. So they return. This is the second half of the 17th century. They build a new synagogue. The menorah is now hiding at the bottom of the stripa, and people have forgotten it. So it comes the night of Slichot. In Elul, in the weeks before Rosh Hashanah, at midnight, we get up to say Slichot. So there was a custom that even the small children, who are usually rushed off to bed at an early hour, were allowed to stay up late on the first night of Slichot, to stay up till midnight to recite these special prayers. And they had a custom. What did the little boys do while they're waiting for Slichot? They had a custom that they would make these kind of paper boats. You remember you used to do this with as a kid. I remember we used to make them out of newspaper. These little paper boats that you could sail on the water, and they would stick a candle into the boat and light the candle and send the candles drifting down the river, because there was a tradition that Jews had been martyred and had died and had been drowned in the river. And these were kind of like the Nerot Nishama, the Yortzeit candles for those dead martyrs in the river. While the children were on the banks of the Stripper shining their candles, a great menorah, such as they had never seen, suddenly shone forth from beneath the water. They said, that must be the menorah of the dead, for the dead bring with them their own menorot when they come to pray. Their hearts quaked in fear, and the children fled. If you've read Twain, there really is something. If you've read Mark Twain, there really is something here. This is a scene, it's a Judaized scene, but you could imagine the equivalent in Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn on the bank of the Mississippi. Right? The children see a menorah in the water. They think it's the menorah of these ghosts, of these the dead martyrs who are who had been drowned in the river. By the way, this custom of floating candles, you can look for it on YouTube. It's really quite beautiful. In Asian societies, in China, in Japan, in Hong Kong, they have these festivals that are often connected to memorializing the dead, where they make these little paper lanterns and they put candles in them and they float them, hundreds of them, down the river. You can find videos of this online, and it's exactly how I imagine what the Stripa River must have looked like in Buchach on Slichot night. Some grown-ups heard the story about the menorah in the river that the children are told. They said, let's go see for ourselves. They go to the Stripa, they see the menorah, they say the story's true, it is a menorah, but not a single person knew that it was the menorah that the king of Poland had given to the Great Synagogue before Tach V'Tat. This is already many decades later. None of them know the story of this menorah. The Jews retrieved the menorah from the waters of Stripa and brought it to the synagogue. Now, question. What's curious about this? As a story that purports to be the history of this one ritual object, and the whole thing is very curious. How are we going to tell 300 years worth of the history of our town through the prism of this one ritual object? Now, suddenly, there's an element here in these first few lines that you see on the screen, which throws a monkey wrench in the whole story. How do we know? How do we know that this is the same menorah? Because they didn't know. The tradition was broken. The history was lost. When they recover this menorah after however many years that it had been hiding out in the riverbed, they don't know what it is. They don't know its provenance, but we know. How do we know? Because our narrator is telling us. I should emphasize that our narrator is not necessarily Agnon himself, but this all-knowing chronicler of the town. And the all-knowing narrator of this novel, of this book, is able to transmit the truths of our town that have been lost to documentary history. And that says a lot about what and how he sets out to do this project. Many days later, after the entire generation had died, a new generation arose that did not know all that had happened to their forefathers. V'yakom dor chadash asher lo yada et Yosef. V'yakam melech chadash asher lo yada et Yosef. Right, that's what it's playing off of. The new king comes and doesn't remember Yosef. So the next generation comes and they didn't remember what had happened before. Again, another Yosef reference. After looking at the menorah day after day, one of them said, but wait a second, that menorah is broken because they had snapped off the middle branch because of the halachic problem of having a 7-branch menorah. And there was a kind of gaping hole there in the middle. They said, it doesn't look nice. They didn't know why there was a hole there, meaning the traditions had already been diluted. They said, we have to make it look nice. So what do? They make an eagle out of glittering brass, and they placed a large amount of lead in the brass so that it would appear to be a white eagle. For a white eagle is the national insignia of Poland. They placed the eagle beneath the spot where their forefathers had removed the branch. As they solder onto this gaping hole in the middle of the menorah, the emblem of Poland. Why do they do that? We will let Poland know how truly attached we are to our country and homeland, the land of Poland. Out of our love for the homeland, we have even placed the national insignia. You know, this is like I know in England it's not like this, but in America, at least when I was a kid, I don't know what it's like now, but in America, every shul that I ever went into in New York and New Jersey, on the bima, there was an American flag and an Israeli flag. The presence of the American flag in American houses of worship dates to World War II. Roosevelt had asked all houses of worship, this whole idea of like flying the red, white, and blue, that's a 20th century invention. It wasn't so omnipresent. American flags over every post office, over every building, in every in every public school, and it was not as quite as common as it is today. It was something that started after during World War II. Roosevelt kind of promoted this idea of displaying the flag. It was a way to rally patriotism and allegiance to the cause. After 9/11, we similarly had a resurgence in America of flying the flag. I remember the first time I went to New York after 9/11, in New Jersey on the highway, right after you go over the George Washington Bridge, there was this gigantic flagpole, and the largest flag I'd ever seen. It was gigantic. This is a kind of like patriotism. So, of course, all the Jews who were largely in those generations immigrants, and there's no patriot as fervent as an immigrant, because you have to show that you're a loyal citizen. It can't be taken for granted. So all the shuls, placed flags in their synagogues. And then later, after the establishment of the state, all the shuls, certainly the Zionists among us, placed the Israeli flag as well. So that's what this is. This is a way to show that we are proud residents and loyal residents of Poland, even if we are not citizens. Now, here's the Polish crest, the Polish national emblem, the white eagle. And we have no end of examples of Chanukiot. If you visit the collection in the Israel Museum or other museums of Judaica, of Chanukiot, of menorahs, Hanukkah menorahs, with the eagle atop the menorah. Here's another one. This is from Poland. This is from the 18th century. Here's one from the Jewish Museum in Budapest. Again, also late 18th century, when Poland still controlled the territory. However, sometime later, Poland was conquered. The country was divided up amongst its neighbors, each neighbor taking for itself all that it could. And Buchach fell to the lot of Austria. The Austrian forces camped across the city, the soldiers, their officers, the entire army that had conquered the territory of Buchach. And so everyone in the city came to make a holiday that God had given them, the Austrian emperor, to protect them beneath the wings of his kindness. You know how it was in this part of the world. You went to bed at night in one country, you woke up the next morning, you were in a different country. Right? You can't tell the players without a scorecard. And just like we were very loyal Polish residents of Poland, well, if today we find ourselves in Austria, that's who we are with. And after Austria conquers Poland, we show that we are loyal to Vienna. The division of Poland, this is important to remember, particularly for all of us. I assume that most of us have some way to trace ourselves back to Poland. There probably, maybe there might be one or two Yekis amongst us. But, these days, who's a pure anything? No, none of us are purebred, right? We all have different ancestry. Poland ceased to exist at the end of the 18th century. In 3 successive divisions, Poland was partitioned in 1772, 1793, and 1795. And it was carved up and annexed and taken over by Russia to the east and northeast, Prussia to the west, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the southern part. And in the first division of Poland in 1772, the region called Galicia, what you see here on the bottom of the screen in orange, that's Galicia. You see Lvov is right there, smack dab in the middle, and Buchach is a little bit to the southeast. Galicia is conquered and controlled by Austria, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is the easternmost outreach of the Austro-Hungarian Empire from 1772 until after World War I. The entire time that Agnon is living there, he's living he's part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And even though he's telling tales of what we think of as Polish Jewry, He never lived in the country called Poland, because from 1795 until 1918, there was no country called Poland. There was an ethnicity called Poland. There was a language called Poland. There was a notion of Poland. But there was no country, there was no autonomous reigning country of Poland during all of that time. So there's an event in the synagogue when the Austrian authorities come to kind of declare their presence. And as they were looking, the officers suddenly saw the Polish eagle on the menorah. Hoi Gewalt! They immediately became incensed at the Jews. The synagogue president rushed off, grabbed a mallet, a hammer, a gavel. It's probably not synagogue president. It was probably, what's David? David is your name? Who's YINN congregation? Our Zoom Gabbai. Right? This was probably your job. In the play that we're going to stage of this, you're going to do this. He takes the mallet that they used to use to bang on people's doors to wake them up to come to shul, and he smashes off the Polish symbol. He hit the eagle with the gavel and knocked it off the synagogue menorah. And he removed the national insignia of Poland from the house of worship. The officer said to him, "You acted well. If you had not done this, we would imprison you and the elders of the community." They were flying the wrong flag by accident. Then the army officers ordered that a two-headed eagle be set on the menorah in place of the eagle they had removed. For the two-headed eagle is the Austrian symbol. What did they do with the old Polish, this hunk of metal, this hunk of lead from the Polish symbol? They gave it to the metal worker. They gave it to the metalsmith, Yisrael Soref, Yisrael the metal worker, and he melted it down. He made a brass eagle with two heads, and he set the two eagle headed on the menorah in place of the one-headed eagle. And the young boys took the eagle that Yisrael, the metal worker, had discarded, and they brought it to him to make dreidels for them to play with during Hanukkah. And those are the very same dreidels that our grandfathers told us about, the dreidels of burnished brass that Yisrael, the metalworker, made for the children of Buchach. And this is why this is not a Hanukkah story, even though the central symbol in the story is a dreidel, is a menorah. It's a Hanukkah story because of this side reference to the dreidels. What is, after all, the legend of the dreidel? It's complete folklore. It has no historical basis whatsoever. The custom of spinning the dreidel is a quite late custom. But the custom of the dreidels was the idea that during the Greek persecution at the time of Hanukkah, among the things that were forbidden to us, aside from Shabbat observance and Brit Milah, was, of course, Torah study. But a Jew can no longer live without Torah study than a fish can live out of water. So we always found ways to surreptitiously study Torah. So what they did was they kept the dreidels, so that if the Greeks were to come in and catch us with the Gemara or with the Chumash or whatever we were learning, we would quickly stick that underneath the table and whip out the dreidel and give it a spin, and they would see that we were merely playing at this game. Meaning the dreidel itself, in its folkloric accretions of meaning, becomes the symbol of pulling one over on the goyim. It's the classical symbol of showing we're more clever than they are. They're more powerful than us, but we have the Yiddish cup. We've got the Jewish way of thinking, and we can pull it over the wool over their eyes. What's going on with these eagles on the menorah in the shul? It's a game of dreidel. We can spin it around however you want. One-headed eagle, two-headed eagle. We'll always show you that whoever's in power, you know who we really, really believe in? Whoever's in power. Because that's where our interests lie. And this is part of the complexity of the Jewish need to maintain proximity to power, even though we know it's really dangerous. Here's the double-headed Austrian symbol. And they made a menorah with a symbol like this. And if you travel to Vienna today, if any of you has been to Vienna, you see this symbol still in place all over the place. I should mention in passing that in non-corona times, through Beit Agnon, we organize these really interesting summer travel seminars to Europe. And in 2019, we are planning on going to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. Oh, but that was canceled in 2019 because of the corona. So in 2020, we're going to Budapest. And in 2021, we're also going to go to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. And since we didn't do it either of those years because of corona, so we're hoping to go in this coming summer in July to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest, a kind of touring seminar in the footsteps of the great works of Jewish literature and Jewish learning. And if you're interested, and God willing and corona willing, we're going to do that. Maybe some of you would like to join us, but we'll send you information on that afterwards. We're going to skip ahead quite a bit in the story. It's getting late. I know it's, it really is late. But if you, Brian, do we have time to indulge us a little more?
Yeah, don't see why not. Yeah, carry on.
So we're going to skip ahead to World War I. When we last left the story, we were at the end of the 18th century. The Austrians had taken over. There was actually an attempt of the Poles to revolt back, and they were going to quickly switch the eagle, back and forth, right? But that Polish revolt was put down, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was actually quite favorable to Jewish life throughout the 19th century, comes to an end in World War I. As conditions in the war, in World War I, grew more difficult, it became harder for the soldiers to find weapons to shoot. So they took metal utensils, large and fine utensils, and they melted them down in order to make out of them weapons with which to destroy the country. These soldiers came as well to the Great Synagogue in Buchach. But just as they were about to seize the menorah, the sound of Russian tanks was heard. The Austrian forces immediately fled for their lives and left behind all they had taken. But the metalworker, another metalworker, it can't be that same old Yisrael because that story took place 100 years earlier, more even. But the metalworker, the one who had come with the army officers when they came to take the brass utensils, he did not flee. He took the menorah and hid it in a place that only he knew. Now, again, the menorah goes into hiding, like, Raiders of the Lost Ark. This time, not in the Stripa River, but some other place. He took the menorah and hid it in a place that only he knew. No one else knew its place, and no one gave a thought to the menorah, for all anyone cared about was saving his own life in the Great War. When the war ended and the land of Poland that had been fought over came under Polish rule, and the town of Buchach was also given over to Poland. So after World War I, the nation called Poland is reconstituted, and Galicia, including Buchach, becomes southern Poland. Again, today, it is part of a nation that no one had ever heard of prior, called Ukraine. Right? Of course, there was always a Ukrainian people and a Ukrainian language and a Ukrainian culture, but there was no country called Ukraine until after World War II. And even then, it was not a country, but a satellite state of the Soviet republics. And only in 1991, with the fall of communism, did you have an actual authentic nation called Ukraine. One man who had been born in Buchach came home after being a captive in Russia during World War I. And it happened that when he came to the Great Synagogue on Friday night and saw that the menorot of tin and wood that were there without any beauty, he remembered, because everything had been stolen. Anything of metal had been stolen for scrap. So after the war, when they come back and reopen the shul, they have menorot made out of tin. He remembered how he happened to be in the trenches during the war with a certain metalworker, and how that metalworker had told him that when the Russians advanced upon Buchach, he had hidden the town's great menorah to keep it from falling into the Russian hands. But before the metalworker was able to tell him where he had hidden the menorah, a cannon hit the trench, and the two never saw each other again. So this fellow who knows that the menorah is hidden somewhere, he just doesn't know where, he comes back to Buchach. The next morning on Shabbat, the man was called to the Torah, for it was the first Shabbat since he had returned to his hometown. The Torah reading for that Shabbat was the portion called Parshat Truma, which begins with Exodus 25. As the Torah reader read aloud the section in scripture describing the making of the menorah that was used in the tabernacle, he came to the verse, "Note well and follow the patterns for them that are being shown to you on the mountain." At that instant, the man knew the menorah was hidden on a mountain. In other words, he comes back to Buchach. He has this desire to find the hidden menorah and to put it back in its place of glory. But like the Ark of the Covenant, it's hidden. We need Indiana Jones. He gets an aliyah. It's the morning of Parshat Truma. What do we read about on Parshat Truma? The menorah of the Beit HaMikdash. According to when HaKadosh Baruch Hu explained to Moshe to make the menorah, Moshe did not exactly understand how it was supposed to look, how it was meant to be configured. And God showed him a heavenly vision in fire of what the menorah is supposed to look like. Look and make the menorah as I have shown you on the mountain. So this soldier who returned from captivity and wants to find Buchach's menorah, he gets an aliyah. And what are they talking about in the aliyah? Look to the mountain for the menorah. And he knows that Buchach is a town surrounded by hills, by small mountains. And he figures, that's it. It's a sign. It's a heavenly sign that the menorah is hidden on the mountaintop. The problem is Buchach is surrounded by mountains. So he's going from mountain to mountain, looking all over for the hidden menorah. He's not sure which mountain it's on. There was not a mountain of all the mountains around Buchach he did not search. And it came to pass one day, while he's trekking around these mountaintops, the man was returning home, and another man was standing on the road, crippled in his legs, missing an arm. Many times Agnon describes the horror that was visited upon many Jewish soldiers who fought in the war and were maimed and crippled and wounded. Of course, we should note the army in which these Jewish soldiers were fighting was on behalf of Germany. Austria and Germany were allies in World War I. The tragedy kind of hidden between the lines is that all of these World War I veterans who fought gallantly on behalf of the fatherland with no discrimination with no distinction between one person and next, were sent just as quickly off to Auschwitz 25 years later. The two of them stood there. They looked at each other in astonishment, exclaimed, Baruch Mechaya Meitim, or probably more precisely, Baruch Mechaya Meisim. Blessed be he who resurrects the dead. In other words, it was that fellow from the trench who he had presumed had been dead. He says, I'm looking for the menorah. Where'd you hide it? The metalworker said, it's hidden in the floorboards underneath my house. Meaning the man was mistaken. He mistook the sign of what was told him in the Aliyah. It's not on a mountaintop at all. It's underneath this metalworker's house. You know that very well-known Agadah, which actually is centered in Prague, not in Galicia, about the fellow who has a dream that in Vienna there's a great treasure buried under the Charles Bridge. The Charles Bridge? No, not in Vienna, in Prague. He has a dream that in Prague, under the Charles Bridge, there's a great treasure hidden. And he goes and he finds it, and the police see him like digging up something, and they say, and he knows he's in a lot of trouble, and they say, "What are you doing, Jew?" And he says he figures he better just fess up, and he says, well, I had a dream that there was in Prague underneath this bridge there was a great treasure, and the policeman just laugh at him and say, "Could you imagine? Jews, they're so ridiculous." The policeman says, "I myself had a dream last night that underneath the floorboards of a Jew named Yankov Ben Shmerel in Buchach, there was a treasure there. What are the chances of that? And he was in other words, the chasing his own dream, he finds this non-Jewish policeman who had a dream about him, and he runs home and finds the treasure underneath his own floorboards. The treasure was there at home all along. Dorothy, had the power to go home the whole time. She just had to click her heels together. There's no place like home. The story can be interpreted in a whole variety of ways, but Agnon might be playing off of this idea. So they go, there's a problem. His house has been demolished. They have to dig underneath it. Long story short, they find the menorah, they remove it, they bring it to the synagogue, they put it up on the bima as it had been in earlier days. The metal worker says, but what's the problem? Now that we're back to Poland, it's once again bearing the wrong insignia. It still has the Austro-Hungarian two-headed eagle. So the current metal worker says, I'll cut off the bird with two heads, for Austria has ceased to rule over Buchach. And if they're young boys in town, I'll make dreidels from the brass eagle for them to play with during Hanukkah, just as our grandfathers did for our fathers. And this is already a well-established local custom, that every time we have to switch the shingle, every time we have to switch the symbol, every time we have to fly a different flag, what do we do with the old one? We melt it down and we make it into dreidels, the symbol of the idea that we can pull one over on them. He added, let us also not make a one-headed eagle, like the eagle that is the national symbol. Let's stop all of this. Let's stop flying flags. I have heard that the Ruthenians were another ethnic group, like the Ukrainians. They've revolted against Poland, right? Because they said, why should Poland be controlled? This territory was ethnically connected to these Ruthenian people. So the Ruthenians hated this as much as the Jews. Right? First, they were controlled by Poland, and then by Austria, and now again by Poland. Why not make our own country? Why not make a country called Ukraine? Right? So after World War I, there was this Ruthenian uprising to make their own national state, which of course was easily put down by Poland. So he says, until we know who's going to win this race, it's better not to put our money on anyone. Of course, this is around the same time that people are starting to think, maybe we don't belong here at all. Enough already. One-headed eagle, two-headed eagle, no-headed eagle. Why not have something of our own? Because the rise of nationalism after World War I, even though Zionism is an ancient idea, the idea of the return to Zion is born with the moment of galut, of exile. So in between the lines here, particularly in a story that's being written in Yerushalayim in the 1950s, there's a kind of Zionistic undertone hidden between the lines. The two men said to each other, one kingdom comes and another kingdom passes away, but Israel remains forever. And they said, oh Lord, have pity on your people. Let not your possession become a mockery to be taunted by other nations. Now this phrase, again, another phrase which might resonate with you, even though we're reading it in translation. One kingdom comes and another kingdom passes away. In Hebrew, Malchut holechet u'malchut ba'a, v'Yisrael le'olam omeid. That's Agnon's text. One kingdom comes, another kingdom goes, but Israel always endures. First it was Poland, and then it was Austria, and then Poland tried to revolt, but Austria put them down, and then it was Poland, and then the Ruthenians came, and Poland put them down, and then after World War II, it all comes underneath the Soviet control. This, of course, is echoing off the verse towards the beginning of the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. Dor holech v'dor ba v'haaretz le'olam amet. One generation comes, another generation goes, and the earth, the land, forever endures. That's the echo that Agnon is playing off of by saying one kingdom comes and one kingdom goes, but Israel always endures. So when you identify the source with which Rashi, Rav Shai Agnon, the source that Agnon is playing off of, so often you have to understand what's hiding behind that pasuk. In other words, by identifying the pasuk that Agnon is playing off of, you've only found the tip of the iceberg. And underneath, of course, is the rabbinic interpretation. Rashi, channeling the rabbinic interpretation on the pasuk, says, "Dor holech v'dor ba, kol ma sherashaya gav amal lashok ligzol eino mavale et maasav." That the wicked toils and labors to oppress and to rob, but he doesn't get to live to see the fruits of his labor. Ki hador holech v'dor acher ba. One generation comes and another generation goes. V'notel hakol midei banav. Right? In other words, I'm going to rob and steal and I'm going to conquer. But I can't enjoy that because I know somebody's going to come and rob and steal it from me, or at least rob and steal it from my children. That's the message of Dor Holech V'Dor Haba. The land is always here, right? It doesn't matter whose flag is flying on it. It's still the land. This Rashi, of course, is very reminiscent of the very first Rashi in Chumash about how we actually lay claim to the land of Israel, even though it was in the possession of 7 other nations before we came back here with Yehoshua ben Nun. So what does it mean, Malchut Holechet to Malchut Ba Yisrael Le'olam Hamed? It's a way of kind of saying that the Jewish endurance is independent. It's a mistake for us to constantly be looking at whose flag is flying. It's a mistake for us to constantly be trying to, it was a historical exigency, but it was a historical trauma that our existence was always somehow tied up with who's going to be nice to us today, who's in power, and who do we have to turn to in power in order to maintain our own identity, our own survival. Because if today it's Poland, tomorrow it'll be Austria, and the day after that it'll be Poland again, and then after that it'll be Russia again, and then after that it'll be Ukraine, and then after that it'll be something else. The whole model is flawed from the beginning. And therefore we have to ask, really, what should be on the menorah? Right? This is the menorah. This is the menorah that we want. I mean, forget for a second that the symbol of the state of Israel, ironically, based upon what we said earlier, is in fact the 7-branch menorah. Outside the Knesset is the famous statue of the 7-branch menorah. And when that was put up in the 1950s, when the Knesset used to be on King George Street in Jerusalem, there were people that were ambivalent about it. Rav Herzog was very ambivalent about that menorah statue, exactly because of the problems mentioned by the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch. In that book that I mentioned by Stephen Fine, the Menorah, he discusses that whole episode. But this is the menorah to which we aspire as the symbol, not with some kind of fakerai Polish sign, and not with some kind of inauthentic Austrian Pledge of Allegiance, but an authentic Jewish, autonomous, sovereign nation in which we will be the masters of our own destiny. And a lot of times we'll get it wrong. Agnon had plenty to say about the foibles of autonomous Jewish life and the kind of silliness that we often get trapped in. Maybe next time we can read one of those stories, his satires of Jewish life in the Jewish land. You know, that kind of idea that, well, like for 2,000 years, we were pretty good at running a shul. So you people know what it means to run a shul. You might even know that sometimes in a shul, people disagree about how to do things, right? But the mentality of like shul politics writ large on a national scale, like what happens when we try to run an entire nation in an army the same way we try to run Shalashudis, right? It might not lead always to the best results. So these are some of the ideas that come out of Agnon's Maseh HaMenorah. It's just one story.